All right, ladies and gentlemen, so I think that each and every single one of us here today, we're under no illusions. We have a very clear crisis in our education system, and our children have been undermined and wronged. You've seen this evening content that is horrific, that you'd never even think about looking at, let alone putting in front of a child. Now, I think a big question that needs to be answered specifically is, how did we get here? The simple answer to that question is that elections have consequences, and they have very big consequences in this instance. So, being involved in the outskirts of minor party politics myself, I have an interest in government policy, programs, legislation, and the impacts of which they have on society. And that's what my talk is going to be about. It's going to be very nuts and bolts. I'm not going to speak for long, but I really want you, each and every one of you, to understand how we came to a position where the government has free rein, literally, over your children. Okay, so first of all, yes, we're speaking about the topic of hypersexualized content in schools, including but not limited to radical gender theory. So it's probably no surprise, ladies and gentlemen, that non-binary students in Australian schools have increased 20-fold in 4 years. And this is a recent article, okay? A direct correlation between the prevalence and the rolling out of these types of agendas in schools, shown right there in the statistics. Moving along here, another point that I need to speak about, also contributing to this drastic rise in underage people who are confused about their gender, is the undermining of parental rights. And you might be thinking to yourself, how can the government simply make decisions without my consent? Well, I'm going to show you. And I'm going to read a few paragraphs verbatim, because otherwise, if you're new to this topic, you'd probably think that I'm making it up, okay? This is published right here on the Education Department of Victoria's website, Mature Minors, a policy to undermine, usurp, and replace parental consent and knowledge of what children are getting up to in schools. I'm going to read to you straight from here, so you know that I'm not taking it out of context. Quote, "The purpose of this policy is to provide guidance on when and how to assess a student as being mature enough to make their own decision about a, quote, particular cause." Notice the ambiguous language here. Make no mistake about it, it's extremely intentional. It goes on to say here, quote, "Where a student under the age of 18 asked to make a decision instead of their parent or carer, principals," all right, not parents, principals, or other working with students in schools can decide that the student is capable of making their own, quote, decisions, or that they are what is referred to as a mature minor. Okay, this is a principal, a school teacher who you don't know, they're not a relative, but thanks to the Victorian state government has been given capability to have powers over your children, even without your knowledge, let alone your consent. Moving along here, this is straight from the Department of Education from Victoria. Thanks to Dan Andrews, by the way, all of these policies came under his premiership. "The law recognises that as children become older and more mature, they are more capable of making their own decisions about a wide range of issues, including decisions about their education." Okay, so if your child is being indoctrinated or brainwashed in school, well, the schools and the principals now have the power to say, well, no, I think this is in the interest of Tommy, stuff what the parents think. Okay, healthcare, including but not limited to medications, and well-being, whatever that means, because we know the government likes to use euphemisms. It goes on to say that the law recognises that a young person may reach this stage before they are 18 years old. But this is what's really the kicker right there. There is no specific age when a young person may be sufficiently mature and capable of making their own decisions. Okay, written right there in black and white by the Department of Education. That could be a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old who is supposedly considered by the state mature enough to be making decisions about their healthcare and well-being. Moving along here, another program by the Victorian state government that is coupled hand in hand with the mature minor policy from the Education Department, doctors in secondary schools. So what exactly is this program and why has it received millions of dollars in government funding? Now, the objectives on face value They sound pretty good, okay? Make primary healthcare more accessible to students. Fantastic. Assist young people to identify and address any health problems early. Great. Reduce the pressure on working parents. Why, thank you, government, for being so considerate to ease the burden on working parents. But just like anything, any program from the government that sounds too good to be true, the devil is always in the details. I'm going to keep reading here from this exact page published by the Victorian State Government. Consistent with Australian common law, the program recognises that any student who wants to see the GP will be permitted to book an appointment. The GP will decide whether the young person is mature enough to consent to medical treatment, right? You got that one, medical treatment, or whether parent/carer consent is needed, as is the case with all GPs in the community. Okay, so this policy right here is bestowing the capability on principals and doctors to make up their own mind whether or not a parent needs to be involved in a decision that includes but is not limited to the prescription of medications to young people. Okay, and given the prevalence of radical gender ideology pushed in schools and more students, of course, adopting this lifestyle and the undermining of parents' rights and doctors in schools that can prescribe drugs, it's not out of the question to think, well, maybe students are being prescribed with the very contentious hormone therapy treatment, which is now available to young people in Australia. Now, you might be thinking, well, surely not. Surely that's where they draw the line. Well, I hate to break it to you, but it absolutely is not. Part of a $21 million program funded by the Victorian State Government, GPs trained to prescribe hormones to trans teens. Okay, this was published less than 1 year ago. So this is all part of the government, what they refer to as a strategy, and all part of a plan the government has in order to facilitate and allow people who are underage to be consuming these synthetic hormones. They're called hormone therapies with potentially disastrous results. And by the way, the clinical trials are very inconclusive. Okay, so first of all, I echo the sentiments of other people on this panel when I say that God doesn't make mistakes and nobody is born in the wrong body. All right, but this is absolute insanity, and I'm not the only person who thinks so. The government of the UK also agrees that these hormone therapies are simply too dangerous for underage people, for young people to be consuming, and as a result of this, have issued a ban. Okay, so the question that I ask you is, why on one hand are these drugs too dangerous for underage people in the UK, yet they're completely fine for students and underage people here in Victoria and around Australia? It seems to me that we have a government that has completely thrown their duty of care out the window, and as I said before, elections have consequences. And furthermore to this matter, if you're a parent or if you're a concerned individual and you seek to counsel a young person who has been brainwashed in school and who is entering the path of hormone therapies, then it's possible that in the state of Victoria you could be facing criminal offences. Furthermore to that point, Victoria Police has an entire page on their website, an entire page specifically for the reporting of suppression crimes. Okay, so yeah, this is actually happening in this state. Moving along here, I'm going to touch briefly on the hormone therapies market, because if you're like me and you see something that's not right in this world, my reaction is to follow the money and look for some answers. This is not always a foolproof strategy in life, but it can help to paint a broader picture of the issues of which we're facing. Now, this is coming from the United States Sex Reassignment Hormone Therapy Research Report of 2023. So keep in mind, the stats that I'm going to mention are only from the United States and do not account for the rest of the world, and of course are in US dollars. Market to reach $2.23 billion by 2030. Supportive regulations and novel therapies propel expansion. So what are we talking about when we look at regulations? We're talking about government policy. We're talking about greenlighting these very dangerous drugs into the market for the consumption of young people without their parents' consent. We're talking about expedited approval processes through the Therapeutic Goods Administration and other health regulators around the world. I'm going to keep reading to you from this financial report. It goes on to say the rate of growth is at a compound annual growth rate of 4.05% per annum. So in other words, you have shareholders and investors who are literally getting more and more excited by the day because they are supremely confident that they will realize profits to the likes of which they've never seen before at the expense of the generations of children all throughout the Western world. And by the way, they're not doing this in Eastern Europe or China or other countries, and that's probably a story for another day. I'm going to keep reading to you here. This is really critical. The growth is attributed to the, quote, increasing awareness. Are we really dealing with increasing awareness, or are we dealing with brainwashing and indoctrination? It goes on to say about sex reassignment treatments and the rising patient pool seeking gender affirmation surgery and hormonal therapy. Well, when it's getting shoved down children's throats, what choice do they have at such a young, malleable and vulnerable age? The number of such patients has increased fourfold in the past years. Hormone therapy is a more economical solution than surgical procedures, which of course has the likes of Pfizer and other companies chomping at the bit. It goes on to say, while it offers a cost-effective solution, okay, notice the very business terminology here, it necessitates long-term commitment and consistent usage to achieve desired outcomes. So in other words, get them on the drugs young, keep them for a lifetime, keep those share prices rising, and allow the shareholders and those who have a financial interest in this booming industry to keep the profits rolling in at the expense of children, sometimes at the expense of young people becoming sterile as a result of these synthetic hormones that, quite frankly, and according to the government of the UK, should not be consumed by underage people. All right, this is a case in point right here. One of the world's biggest manufacturers of hormone therapies, AbbVie, look at their 5-year share price. It correlates exactly. And I'm not saying that correlation necessarily equates to causation, but you can't help but to notice that 5 years ago to now, their share price has increased by 160.24%, a direct correlation with the abundance of radical gender theory taught in schools and the undermining of parents' rights here in Victoria under the Daniel Andrews Labor government and other governments around the world. Moving along here, I'm not going to go through too much of this. Please do your research at home. We have more than enough studies published by respectable organisations such as the National Library of Medicine that has weighed in the concerns, the side effects of these drugs and the effects it has on young people, and has labelled it of considerable magnitude in terms of the lack of data and the potential consequences. And by the way, I'm going through this pretty quickly, so if you'd like a copy of my presentation, then just come to me afterwards and I'll share with you all my sources, all my resources. I want this to get out there because at the end of the day, as a nation, we're failing to protect our children. Senator Babbitt is doing a tremendous job in the Senate. He's one man. We need more of him. Elections have consequences. All right, moving along here. This is a perfect visualization of states in the United States of America, state governments that have outlawed hormone therapy consumption for underage people. Okay, this is going to make more sense to you in just a moment. Have a look at this. What do you notice? What do you notice? If you're a parent in the United States and you care about the welfare of your child, you have no choice but to vote Republican. This is a mirror image. This is a mirror image, and this shows you the difference in political ideology. We have one side of politics that says, stuff the children, shove whatever drugs you want down their throat, and you have another side that is righteous, that stands up, that recognizes that protecting children is not just a matter for parents or teachers, but a normal duty in a civilized society. And that brings us... That brings us to the most destructive person to ever hold a position in office in Victorian history, and that was the former Premier Dan Andrews. Elections have consequences. It was under Dan Andrews that we saw the not just the undermining, but the robbery of parents' rights. So many bills, so many legislation, 9-month abortion. Dan Andrews bringing in these policies through the Department of Education and remaining completely tight-lipped when faced with the very real data of how these hormone therapies can so drastically destroy the lives of Victorian children. And this image right there, it's a notorious photo right now. That was taken from an event that Dan Andrews hosted in our parliament where he brought in drag queens to conduct a performance in front of children as young as 1 year old. Now you may be thinking, well, not to worry, we have opposition in this state. Well, I hate to break it to you. This guy right here, the only objection raised by our opposition leader, John Pizzuto, when Dan Andrews brought a drag queen into Parliament to perform in front of children, was that he did not receive an invitation. In other words, we're in a political crisis right now, and the time has never been more desperate and more timely for Victorians and Australians to get involved in politics, to support Aidan McClendon in his bid for local council, to support Ralph and his colleagues, because if we do not act now, Australia will be lost forever. And let's face it, a country that neglects to protect its most vulnerable and innocent citizens cannot be classified as any type of decent civilized society, and we may as well just accept to go back to the Stone Age. Personally, I'm not willing to accept that. That's why I'm still in here involved in minor party politics, and I know that none of you are willing to accept that. That's why you're here today. So I'm going to summarise before I wrap this up. Number one, underage students in Victoria are being indoctrinated with hypersexualised content, including radical gender theory, and these are all facts, by the way. 2, underage students in Victoria are now identifying as the opposite gender or no gender at record rates. 3, government policy and programs such as mature minors and doctors in schools have removed parental knowledge and consent, thus allowing underage students to be prescribed with drugs, including but not limited to hormone therapies. 4, the Victorian government spent millions of dollars, our dollars, training GPs on how to prescribe hormone therapies to underage people. 5, those who try to intervene and stop an underage person from taking hormone therapies could be committing a criminal offence right here in the state of Victoria. 6, governments around the world are banning hormone therapies due to the associated risks, but our government says, no problem. Allow them to keep paying their annual subscription fees to the TGA and allow doctors to prescribe them to kids in schools completely unbeknownst to parents. 7, big pharmaceutical companies are projected to hit record profits in the hormone therapies market, and that is a financial fact. 8, elections have consequences. So, in conclusion, there's really only one conclusion, and that is, for one reason or another, our government and the majority of our elected representatives, with few examples, have completely let us down. We don't have time to wait until the next election to take action. Victorian and Australian children, they need us right now. All right, they're not waiting for the next Victorian state election or for whenever Albo calls the federal election. So the question is, what can you do about it? Let me tell you something. Pressure works. Okay? The people in these schools that are allowing the destruction of children's lives, they don't want to be exposed. So you send emails, you make phone calls, you take every measure in your capability to find out what is being taught in your child's school. If you don't have school-age children, speak to somebody who does. Because let me tell you, when the pressure mounts, what you'll find is that those who are inflicting this tremendous injustice against our children, guess what? They're not very strong. They're going to wilt. They're going to back down. But that all depends on you. So if there's one thing you take away from this evening, please fight for the children of this country. Amen. And that's all I have to say, so thank you for listening.